let's go back to where I was. I said I'll buy you lunch. You tell me the third book of the New Testament. There were 4 guys standing there. They're all older guys than I am, which is pretty old. Did you know not a single one of those 4 guys knew the third book of the New Testament? Now, I wouldn't name any of them. I love them all. But one of the most amazing things to me is how little that people actually do know about the Bible. I want y'all to start asking questions around other people and answering questions around other people. Somebody that you might not think, not to intimidate, not to hurt their feelings or anything, but just to enlighten them on the fact that, hey, we need to know something about God's Word. Now, I started this Bible Basics thing trying to get as many people as I could to remember some of the highlights of the Bible. There's so much infrastructure inside the Bible to learn and to know. You know, I will never know it all. I will never be able to gather all of the information that I need to gather. And I'm sure that if Brother Murphy was still here or Brother Watkins, they'd tell you the same thing. There's still things that they didn't know. Brother Box told me some of the things the other night. He said, you know, he'd studied all of his life, and he said there were a few questions in his mind as well. Now, tonight we're going to look at our Gospels again. Now, briefly we're going to go back and review a little bit. The first book of the New Testament is what? And who wrote that book? Okay, and how many chapters is in that book? Okay, 28, okay. Now, who was the book written to? I see y'all looking down, and that's okay. But honestly, try to get these big things out of the way. You know, Matthew wrote Matthew. Matthew is a Jew writing to Jews about Jew, which is Jesus, okay? Now, the whole inner infrastructure of the book of Matthew deals with our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Well, what are some of the very basic things that Matthew talks about in his book, in the first book in the New Testament? What does he tell us about Christ? What does he start with and end with? What's he talking about? He starts with his birth, death, burial, and resurrection. Okay, that's the premise of all 4 of those Gospels. If you think about it, these are men writing about Jesus. They're introducing Jesus. Now, I told you that the book of Matthew, in those 28 chapters there, they tie the old sort of more or less in with the new, except they bring you up to date. They do a lot with the genealogy, and there's a reason for that, because, you know, Matthew writes that book exclusively in such a way as to get the Jews on board to say, you know, this is Christ. He's born, he's going to live and die, and he's going to be crucified, and this is our forgiveness. This is what it's all about. Now, in the book of Matthew, we learn some very important things. I only ask you to remember a couple of them. Anybody remember the chapter? Don't look down. The chapter and the verses where I find 12 very important men that are called apostles. And where is that? Matthew 10, verses 1 through 4. Okay, now, here's what we didn't do, and I got scolded a little bit about this. We didn't name those men in the way that we should. But before we name those apostles, those 12 apostles, out of the 4 Gospels, which one in the 4 Gospels was not an apostle? Let's see if you know that before we start. We just finished up his book last week. That's a big hint. Luke. He's not one of the 12 apostles. Now, somebody left out the other night and said, well, I didn't know Luke was an apostle. He's not an apostle. He was not named in the apostles. Now, let's go and let's see if we can name the apostles. Can anybody do it? You know, it used to be a little song everybody sang, but I'm not Miss. I told Miss Judy this afternoon, I don't want us to have to sing the song to name the apostles. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Philip and Bartholomew. Okay? Then you start with Thomas and Matthew. Anybody know James the Less? Y'all know who he is? What's the next one? Thaddeus. And then Judas and Simon and Judas. He's listed before Judas in the 12. I would really like for all of you, even if you have to sing your little song to get it in your mind, I would like for all of you to remember those apostles. There's 12 of them. Now, out of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Luke is the only one writing in the Gospels that's not one of the apostles. Now, they say, well, what's the significance of that? There's really no significance to it because we know what Luke did when he was writing about Jesus. But it does give us a sense, a lot of people think Luke was an apostle, but he wasn't an apostle. There was 12 apostles in the very beginning. There was another one later on in the New Testament that you'll find out was an apostle that was actually chosen out of due season. He wasn't chosen whenever Jesus went and named and brought those men on board as the apostles. And this man became the most prolific writer of all of the New Testament, and that's the Apostle Paul, which is Saul. And we'll talk a lot about that as we go through. I want to go back to the book of Matthew just very briefly here, and I want you to remember, where is it we find, y'all don't answer out here, where is it that we find those apostles? Matthew 10, 1 through 4. Okay, good. All right, now, I'm going to do a new one tonight for you, but I want to do a better job than I've done before. When we talk about Matthew, he had a job, and before we leave that, Matthew did something that really and truly wasn't so popular. Do anybody know what he was? He's a tax collector. He's a publican, okay? He's a tax collector. That wasn't a very popular thing with people. They didn't like that. And so that was what he was. Anybody know who he was the son of? He's the son of Alphaeus, okay? The son of Alphaeus. I want you to think about just some of the highlights. So if somebody comes along and wants to buy your dinner and they ask you this question, you'll know that Matthew was a publican. He's a tax collector. He's the son of Alphaeus. He writes the first book of the New Testament, And in that book of the New Testament, in Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, we find all of the apostles. That's what I want you to remember. Now, we know the premise of the book, the big picture of the book is all about Jesus. It's about his birth, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection. That's what Matthew's about. Now, as we went to Mark, and he has 28 chapters, in the book of Matthew, we went into the book of Mark. There was something else in the book of Matthew that I might want you to remember, if you could. In Matthew chapter 16, you remember there was someone who said, "Who am I?" Jesus says, "Who am I?" Talking to Peter. And Peter says, "Thou art Christ, the Son of the living God." And then Christ, "Upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." This is where the Lord has come to an understanding that He's going to build His church. He's going to build it on this premise. He's going to build it on this faithful statement that thou art Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is how He's going to build His church. Now, I'm going to leave Matthew. Let's go to Mark real quick so I can get done tonight what I'd like to do. In the book of Mark, anybody remember how many chapters there is in the book of Mark? 16. Okay? There's 16 chapters in the book of Mark. Now, the main thing about Mark is written to what? To who? If Matthew's written to the Jews, Mark to the Gentiles, okay? He's writing to the Gentiles. Now, the Gentiles have never been, to this point, they have never been God's chosen people because they're not Jews, they're Gentiles, okay? And Mark's writing to these Gentiles. He's talking to them basically about some of the same things that Matthew's talking about, except he's got to bring them on board a little bit more so in some of the areas that sometimes people have forgotten. Some of the things that might relate to Mark more so than anything is something called baptism, okay? We know what baptism is, don't we? We know what it's for. It's to wash away our sins. But in order to get to baptism, we got to have Christ to die, and we got to have Christ to be buried and resurrected, and we got to have the mark of the gospel, and we got to have some way or another to get rid of those sins. And it's through this that Mark elaborates in his gospel about the importance of baptism. And I wanted you to remember where it was. Does anybody remember the book, chapter, and verse where it says that we have to be baptized? We cannot be saved without it. We have to be baptized. Mark 16, 15, and 16. All right, now, I'm just getting the top money things today on this for all of you, and we're going to start a new one tonight. 16 chapters. I believe, and this is the shortest, if I say, which book is the shortest one of the four Gospels? Which one is it? Mark, with 16 chapters. Matthew had what? How many? See how quick you are. 28. Okay, good. All right, let's look again right here for just a moment. Now, I believe Mark probably is the quickest, easiest, and shortest one of the Gospels to read, and maybe one of the easiest to understand. There's not anything hard about any one of the four Gospels to understand, but it's very important that you understand that in this chapter, in these 16 chapters, that Mark himself is getting the Gentiles, he's getting them with information about Christ. And he's telling them some of the same things that Matthew has said, except some of the Jews, they got to know a little bit more about how it's all tied in. The Gentiles don't. He's trying his best. He doesn't use as much genealogy as does Matthew. Now, in the book of Mark, Jesus is tempted by Satan. That's one of the big things that I want you to remember. In the book of Mark, which one of the four Gospels has the temptation of Jesus by Satan? Mark, okay? Remember that for me. Let's go to Luke real quick, and then we'll talk about the other one. Luke has 24 chapters. Luke is not one of the apostles. Luke is commonly referred to by those that's supposed to know as somewhat of a historian, because Luke himself had very close ties to the Apostle Paul. Luke has so much to say about Christ from the standpoint that he himself was actually, his profession was that he was a what? He is a physician, okay? Now, he has much to say about Christ. Luke he writes not just only to the Jews, not just only to the Gentiles, but Luke writes his letter both to the Jew and the Gentile. He writes his to both, okay? And there's a very, very important point that needs to be made about that, because he has to broaden the horizon for Jesus Christ. And in the book of Luke, and Christ himself in the book of Luke, one of the most important things is at every turn he talks about Christ having to die upon the cross, more so than the others, in that this is how we're going to gain salvation. You Gentiles, you Jews, this is how we're going to do it. So Luke was with very close ties to some of the apostles, one of them being that of the Apostle Paul, which was chosen later on and not during the time that the first 12 was actually chosen. Luke was there. He was a historian. He knew about it. He wrote about it. He understood. He was witness, okay, to it. He writes his letter to, is referred to as Theophilus. Now, a friend of God. Don't know much about him. Just know a little bit about what some of your writers say, but it would be wrong for me to stipulate on some of the things that they're saying, because it may not be exactly right. I've learned a great deal about some of the things that people comment on, and sometimes it may not be exactly right. But he says, my most excellent Theophilus. Theophilus being that of a friend of God. He talks about him being most excellent, about him being most noble, and a man of high standing, we believe Theophilus was. Now, Luke explains something that needs to be explained to the Gentiles, and he's writing to both Jew and Gentile, but he has to explain to the Gentiles what some of the customs for the Jews were. Now, the Jews had different customs than the Gentiles in that the way they worshiped God and some of the things that they did. The Gentiles, this was Greek to them. This was foreign. They didn't know. So Luke has to write all about those things that we have to learn, Gentiles, so we can worship God properly. So he has to bring on the Jewish customs to them and show them the way so that they can worship God in the way that they ought to. Now, there's some key things about Luke. Chapter 15, I want you to remember this. This is one of the big things in Luke. Luke uses parables, okay? Parables are creative, they're true, but they're creative stories to elevate and to make a point, okay? A parable. There were 3 parables very much important to chapter 15 in the book of Luke. Does anybody know what they are? One of them is the lost. Okay, we got the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. Okay? Now, think about this, because the point that Luke makes, is the importance of something that's lost that has to be found, and the price that's going to be paid for that's lost, it's going to be found. And he brings it home when he talks about this is what the Lord will do for you. If you're lost, you must be found. And then Luke brings it home to tell them how that they can be found. Okay? Now, tonight, in the next 15 minutes or so, I want to talk to you about John. This is the 4th of the 4 Gospels, the first part of the New Testament. The book of John. Now, John has 21 chapters in it. The book of John is more so than any of the other books. I love the book of John. I love the book of Luke. I love them all. But John's gospel brings more to Christ, His power, and the miracles that are performed than any of the other 3. John does it in such a way that it revolves around 7 very important miracles that's performed. And John writes about those miracles. Now, there are 7 statements made and 7 miracles made. Statements as Christ says, I am. Now, if you think about this, John himself, Jesus nicknamed John and his brother James, which was, we learned sometimes back, John and his brother James in Mark chapter 3 verse 17 are named by the Lord himself, given the thought, the sons of thunder. Now we talked maybe a little bit about that. I don't know what that actually meant. There's a lot of speculation in all these Bibles. Some of them have different viewpoints and all of that, and I don't like to deal with that, because I'll be telling you something, you say, well, my Bible doesn't say that. The sons of thunder, okay, they were nicknamed the sons of thunder for specific reasons. Now, some says it's because of their voice, their loudness. Some say it's because of their openness and because of their they're very boisterous. I don't know. But I just know that they are the sons of thunder, and Jesus nicknamed John and his brother James as the sons of thunder. Now John himself, he became so prolific, the last and final one of the apostles to ever live. John, we find at the end of his life, is on the Isle of Patmos in exile. The Romans have thrown him into exile, and he's there. He's going to be killed, but we have no record of that, except that John is the last one of the apostles, the original 12 chosen apostles now, to actually live. Okay, the others, some of them are disemboweled, some of them are killed, some of them are hanged, and all of that. They die horrifying deaths. But anyway, John himself is the last one of the living apostles. And John must have had a special relationship with Christ, more so because when when some of the things that are said in this gospel, is referred to as the apostle of whom Jesus loved. I don't know that, I can't say this and say it truthfully, I don't know this, but undoubtedly this John, which was one of the 12, that was chosen, he may have been an older man. I don't know that for sure. He was an older probably than some of the others. But the Bible indicates this man was someone whom Jesus loved. And I'll show you why in just a moment. It's not said of others, that of others in the apostleship, it's not said as it was said about John, of whom Jesus loved. In John 13, verse 23, he's defined there as the apostle whom Jesus loved. In the book of John, we find the Last Supper. We find that this is when Jesus is sitting with the apostles. And we find that this is when Jesus is revealing to them that he's going to be betrayed by one of them. One of his 12 is going to betray him. And we find in this passage that during this time they're all really just beaten down and sad, but we find John leaning upon the Lord himself. He's leaning against the Lord. He's actually touching the Lord, leaning up against him. And the Bible indicates this apostle of whom Jesus loved. So he must have been somewhat, maybe, I don't want to say a closer relationship with Jesus than any of the others, but it indicates a little bit of the fact that John was very much overwhelmed. You know, he loved Jesus so much and was so obedient to his will that this may have actually put something into the mix about why John wasn't killed like the others. Not that Jesus thought any different of them. He probably loved them as well. We know that. But John, at the Last Supper, when Jesus will reveal that the betrayal of himself was about to take place, then we find that passage. He's leaning against the Lord, and they're asking the Lord questions. Is it I, Lord? Is it I? In chapter 13, you read about the Last Supper. In John 3, in verse 16, you find, now I want you to listen to me, young people, about this one. In John 3:16, this is probably the most, I guess, I don't know this, but this is probably the most quoted of all verses in the Bible. This is probably one that more sermons have actually been preached about than any of the other statements that are made in the Bible. Lots of your writers and lots of your people that are supposed to be so highly educated, they'll say, John 3:16 stands out above and beyond all of the other scriptures within the Bible. Now, whether it does or not, I don't know. I'm just giving you that as a tidbit of information because that's what we're learning. In John 3:16, do y'all know what it says? Can anybody tell me what it says? Right. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. Whosoever believed in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Now, for God sent not His Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through Him might be saved. Now, this is what John was about. This is the powerful lesson of John. We got to have Jesus. He loved the world. He's dying. And this is what you're going to see. And this is what you know. God loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. That whosoever believes in Him, believes in Jesus. Now, the importance of that verse, John 3:16, I can only tell you, it's probably been written down more so, probably been talked about more so, and most people know what John 3:16 actually says. But in counter to that, John to the many looks to be, to me, I guess, the most powerful of the Gospels. The most powerful of the Gospels. Doesn't mean that it has any more pull or it has any more thought injected into this than the inspiration of God to these men that wrote the book. But John has a powerful, powerful Gospel. Maybe the most of all of the Gospels. Now, I'm going to give you 5 little breakdowns of what I think. I don't know if this is right. I believe it is, but I think you'll go along with me if you look at it. If you're looking at the book of John, The incarnation of Jesus, of the Son of God, starts in chapter 1 and goes through about 1 through 18 or 19 in there. This is the incarnation of the Son of God. This is the beginning. This is how it all comes together. And then right immediately after that, in about chapter 4, you have John presenting Jesus as who He is, the Son of God. This is the Son of God. You know. And then you find a little bit of the opposition that we find all the way through the Bible. People oppose Christ. They don't want to deal with that. They pull away from that. And John's he writes a little bit about this opposition to the Son of God. In chapter 5, you start reading about that opposition. And for the next 4 or 5 chapters there, you read about all those that are opposed to Jesus. They don't want Jesus. They want to push Him away. They want Him to go away. He's done so many different things, you know. But the miraculous aspect of Jesus carries on. And in the book of John, there has to be some preparation for the disciples because they're going out into a world where they're going to be hated. And in John's book, he writes to them, and he writes in writing of what's going to be, what you're going to face, what are you going to deal with. The preparation of the disciples by Jesus. Jesus tells them, He says, you know, this is what's going to happen. And if I'd have been an apostle chosen, and you started hearing about what Jesus was telling them about the fact that you don't take nothing with you, you're going to be hated among men, you're going to be tormented, you're going to be betrayed, you're even going to be hurt. I probably would have set sail and run. But in John's book, Jesus is preparing the disciples to go out into the world, preach the gospel to every creature. And he's giving them the emphasis of how important it is. Don't give up. Don't quit. And Jesus is preparing them. And in the latter part of the book of John, you find the preparation of the disciples by Jesus. If you read from chapters 13 up to about, I think it's 16 or 17 there, you read those few chapters and Jesus is talking to them about what's going to take place. What's going to happen to them? What are they going to be in? What can they expect? They're going out into the world to preach the gospel, to talk to them about something that's going to be foreign, and some of them's not going to accept it. And you may even give your life. And we know what happened, don't we? Now, the miracles. There are 7 very basic miracles that were performed in the book of John. I always thought it unique to read about the miracles in the Bible. And I'd just look them up and read about the miracles that was performed. When you think about the miracles, Jesus turning the water to wine, okay? They say, well, what significance is that? It's very significant because, you know, that's just something that Jesus did in the way of miraculous power. He turned the water into wine at the feast. Now, He healed a nobleman's son who was very sick and ill. And we can look at that through looking at the latter part of the book of John. You can look at some of these miracles. You all remember the man who couldn't walk, the paraplegic, you know, and they let him down, you know, and Jesus healed the man, okay? He healed the man that couldn't walk. Not only that, but He fed a multitude of people with just hardly nothing. You remember the feeding of the thousands, the 5,000. And then we find something very unique in there, in one of the miracles that Jesus performed, is some of the apostles are out in the boat, and they're out in the water. And guess who they see coming toward them? You know what He's doing? He's walking on the water, you know. That's one of the 7 miracles that is surrounded there with the book of John. Now, not only that walking on the water, but there was a blind man. You remember the blind man. And Jesus dabbled around and put it upon his eyes, and He gave sight to the blind. You know, so He's healed so far. He's done 6 notable miracles, but there's 7. Everybody remember a man named Lazarus? Everybody remember that fella? You know, he'd been dead for 3 days. He's been in the tomb there for 3 days. And the Lord raises him back. And we see Lazarus walking back. So these 7 miracles, water to wine, the healing of the blind man, the healing of the lame man, the hearing, the walking on the water, the sight to the raising of Lazarus, and all of these miracles. These are basically 7 things that John uses to build up Jesus to be the Son of the living God. He has this power. He can do this. I want to show you this, and I'll tell you this. And he writes about it, and he talks to them about it. And so this is how John gets his point across. It's one of the most powerful, or maybe the most powerful, I don't know, of the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John, he does a great job with getting everything together. And in the last book of the Bible, which is the book of what in the New Testament? Revelation. He's the author of this book, the book of Revelation. He writes this. He's on the Isle of Patmos. Now, I'm not going to talk about Revelations because we hadn't got there yet, but I will tell you this. The Lord Himself allows John to view so many different things to write about. And John does so. And when we get down there to the book of Revelation, we'll talk a little bit about figurative, literal, and figurative and things of that nature. But this is one of those things where from the time he wrote the Gospel of John till the time we see him on the Isle of Patmos and he's in exile, years have passed, but the Lord is still right with him. Even though the Lord has been crucified and raised back again and ascended back into heaven, He's still with John. He's still with John. And old John's down there, and the Lord's revealing those things to John. Talking to him about the church and the things that needs to go on and the 7 churches of Asia. All those things are important. Now, it's about 4 minutes before we quit. Tell me something you learned tonight about the book of John. Just one thing. Anything. I know you can. What'd you learn? One of the most powerful gospel. Anything else? He was an apostle whom Jesus loved. Anything else? Do what? Okay. That's good. I didn't say that, but it's just true. Okay. Huh? That's right. Anything else? Okay. How many chapters? 21. Okay. About 2 minutes. Thank y'all so much. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we want to keep these high points that I give you, and then we'll tie it all together. Again, the 4 Gospels, the main thing with those 4 Gospels is to introduce Christ, to build the platform, and to bring it all together of what we're doing right now. That's reading, studying, and living a Christian life and hoping to go to heaven. And we've got it all together with these 4 Gospels, putting these things together. So, that's all I have for us tonight. We'll have just a minute here to extend the invitation of the gospel. It should be that if there's anyone here tonight, I look around, I don't see that, but it may be that somebody has a need tonight. If there's a need in your life to respond to the invitation of the gospel, I encourage you, come right now while together we stand and as Gary leads us in song.